Welcome to Philosophy 15. I'm Scott Aiken.
And I'm Robert Talisse.
We are the authors of Why We Argue and How We Should, and Political Argument in a Polarized Age. This is the second of our series on Rob's new book.
Sustaining Democracy, What We Owe to the Other Side. And the answer is not nothing.
Not nothing. And so on our last, so this is the second video on this socially distanced citizenship. But one of the things that Rob had suggested in terms of being able to slow down and maybe even mitigate the polarization phenomenon was this kind of reflective, see things from the sort of from a larger perspective, and thinking about the issues. In some ways, theoretically, it's almost like a kind of a case for philosophy, political philosophy. But the second one is that it's also about thinking about the issues without thinking about what others think about the issues. But that's one edge to this sort of mitigating the polarization phenomenon. And that's a kind of a disengagement model. Or a kind of a... Go ahead.
Disengagement from the people who happen to be your contemporary foes.
Right.
But not disengagement. I mean, the important point is reflection on political ideas all by your lonesome is itself a political engagement.
Still kind of engagement. It's diff engagement.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I like that.
Okay, so we've got another way, and so Rob and I we were talking about another possibility here, that to be able to mitigate or sort of change the way that polarization works, and maybe even the possibility of certain kinds of depolarization.
Right.
And so one long-standing thought of depolarizing was this sort of ramp up the engagement. The more that you talk to the other side, the better you are able to handle the polarization phenomenon. So more of these sort of debates, pro-con things, and the more you get exposed to the debates, the better you seem to be able to manage this. But it doesn't look like the data holds that out or bears that out. Is that right?
Well, the data are mixed, as we should expect that they are. Although some people who've got real dogs in this fight about what the right interventions are for polarization, I think sometimes overstate the findings, the empirical findings. So there's some findings that show that carefully curated, orchestrated deliberation encounters, deliberation events, deliberative polling events, citizen juries, citizen assemblies do have a depolarization effect. Now, I will just say, just for the philosophers who may be watching, it's not difficult to, in that literature, which is done mainly by empiricists in political science, it's not difficult in that literature to catch somebody making the error of inferring that the encounter has depolarized people from data that shows that only that polarization has not intensified.
Yes.
There might just be a point at which there's no more polarization.
That's
I got no more polarization to give.
That's depolarized in a sense.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So, so one thought is that you get more pro-con exchanges, and that at least halts the polarization phenomenon, if not reverses it. But again, it looks like it's unclear that that's got, and especially if, and this seems to be the sort of the big thought, which is that if polarization is explained by evidence aggregation, and you might say sort of that you get a kind of curated evidence given who you're talking to, it looks like that would be that expanding the folks that you're talking to would depolarize. But given the fact that it doesn't seem to be sort of a really robust phenomenon, that looks like that counts against the sort of the evidence curation explanation, right? You think that there's another mechanism behind that. There's another explanation.
Right. So it looks like, because polarization is easy to produce under experimental conditions, in context of like-minded discussion,
without any evidence.
Right. Just people affirming each other's view. It looks as if people had drawn the conclusion that belief polarization occurs because of the like-minded discussion.
Right.
You have the information filters, the cascades, the louder and louder echoes of your own voice, and that's the mechanism. Turns out that that's just not true. Turns out that you can get the belief polarization, you get the shift towards more extreme beliefs and attitudes and the tendency to engage in more risky action, even without any exchange of information or ideas, right? It looks as if belief polarization is a lot like what goes on in football stadiums when the home team is playing an important game. It looks as if it's just the desire to fit in when put in a context where that desire is kind of rewarded with corroboration. Yeah, you're one of us too.
Yay.
You got the shirt too.
Yay!
Yeah,
Gang us!
Yeah. Right? That's enough. That feel, that elevation of affect in feeling like you belong with a group that you identify with is enough to get the shift, which means that belief polarization can be initiated even outside of the presence of physical others, right? There are experiments that show that affect and cognitive states, including belief, can be intensified simply by way of showing pie charts, right? Hey, Scott, football fans like you also have these attitudes about meat eating that you're inclined to. You're like, hey, wow, other Cowboys fans are also kind of not cool with eating meat. Well, that makes you more invested in vegetarianism. It looks as if the right account of the belief polarization phenomenon's mechanism is what I call mere corroboration, just the social affirmation of who you are by your allies, by the people who you identify with. Just the "you're one of us" guy is enough to get the extremification initiated.
Okay, so two quick things. First off, amazing that you think that Cowboys fans would be vegetarians. That's hilarious. That's awesome.
I don't even know what sport they play.
That's awesome.
Did I get that they're a football team, right?
Yeah, it's a football team, and I have a feeling that not a lot of vegetarians in them, but that's okay. So the second thing is that it does sound like then that things would look pretty dark for greater evidence aggregation as we go there. So now I guess the question here is, if this is the mechanism of it, how exactly does it get undercut? How exactly do you turn that back around? Except unless it's another. One other thought could be, it would be very hard if it weren't evidence doing it. It would be very hard for us to then be able to see how to change it unless it was also about that group membership.
So good. That last part I think is exactly right. I think that the way to think about depolarization, rather than thinking about how to stop, how to curb it, if we're thinking not about how to prevent ourselves from getting more belief polarized, but instead depolarizing at the levels that we've got, I think that the key is, oddly enough, to stop thinking about the problem of polarization in terms of the animosity and the heat between the opponents. I think that we need to focus on, as we were saying in the last time, the feature of belief polarization that I think is maybe the most fascinating feature, but doesn't get enough screen time, I think, in these discussions, is the connection between the more extreme, extremified, partisan self and the press towards insistence on conformity. So I think that the key to depolarization is first to see that the problem to be addressed, although it may ultimately have to do with how you interact with your political foes. The way to address the problem of interacting with your political foes is to do something to mitigate the pressures towards conformity among your allies. That is, to do something to expand your own sense of permissible doctrinal variation among those on your own side.
So it looks like we have to have some change of focus.
Good.
So it's not that we have to focus on not that. We have to not focus on that. We have to focus on something else.
That's right.
And so, but it still nevertheless has to be on the issues. And so the question then is, how exactly do you get that kind of focus that doesn't have the, what are everybody else going to think about the thing that I think?
That's right. And so I conjecture in the book, and it looks like there's some empirical evidence now that's emerging that shows that the conjecture is right. I say, if the corroborationist story about the mechanism of belief polarization is right, and if the aim to depolarize is to create in us or to devise for us tactics for expanding our sense of permissible doctrinal variation among our allies. Then I say, yeah, when we do these experiments where I sit down with my political opponent in a curated, orchestrated way to, be involved in a deliberative poll or a citizens' assembly or a citizens' jury or some other curated deliberative context, the focus of that interaction should not be, as it typically is, the pro and con. Like, let's sit down and I'm for stricter gun control measures. You're a Second Amendment person who wants weaker gun control measures. And let's try to hear one another's arguments so that we can get an appreciation of what the other side thinks. Now, it might be good to do that.
It needs to start with that, right? It needs to start with that,
Maybe.
Because the second part of this is going to have to require that you actually are familiar with what they say, right?
Well, again, I'm not so sure. Right?
Okay.
I think that what ought to be more thoroughly investigated is the model of a deliberative encounter between political opponents, where the subject or the focus of the encounter is not the pro and con disagreement,
right?
But rather the disagreement of the form. The reasons I give for my gun control view are unconvincing to you. What is weak about them in your view? Where do you think they fail? What's the strongest objection? Why are you unmoved by my gun control argument?
They don't get to say because I've got a great argument. They have to say something about your argument.
That's right.
Right.
You have to hear what the other side assesses as the weakness or the shortcomings of your own position. You have to hear, as it might be, the reasons against you rather than weigh up the two different sets of reasons for. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Good. So yeah, there's a Justin Snedegaard paper on this that I think is really helpful.
Yep.
And so what that means is that there's a deliberative encounter in which I'm not required going into it to think the thought, oh, I have to hear their reasons because, hey, they might be right. They might have a point. I might have to mitigate. I might have to adjust my view. No.
Those are virtuous attitudes to have. But one doesn't need to be virtuous in order to be depolarized.
And
that's the lesson.
We're trying to get to a position where I can more reliably manifest the virtuous attitudes.
That's right.
So we can't presuppose
You can still be even, and that's right. And you can still even just be perfectly strategic about this. So it's even just out of pure strategic thinking, where it's like, well, getting this feedback from them will actually help me make a better argument to convince them.
That's right.
And that would presumably even be consistent with, again, it doesn't have to be thought, but it could even be consistent with you towing the party line for your party, where it's like, I'm doing oppo research on them about the things that they think are bad about our view, so that I can improve it so that we can convince them and win.
That's right. And I think that we need depolarization is a matter of putting us in deliberative contexts where we can become more mindful of and remind ourselves that even when we've got the right political conclusions, our political thinking, our political reasoning can always be improved. Because I think that's the key, or I conjecture, that's the key to widening your sense of permissible doctrinal variation among your allies, is keeping yourself in the presence of the thought that my own political thinking can always be improved. Now, in deliberative encounters where I'm hearing what the other side sees as the weaknesses or vulnerabilities of my position, that's a way of saying, well, look, there are at least 4 or 5 different ways of articulating the gun control position. One way gets this kind of response from the people on the other side. I got to figure out a better way to formulate it because I don't want to have to deal with that kind. Here's the way they misunderstand this. Let me formulate it, bulletproof it in a way so it doesn't invite that misunderstanding. And then all of a sudden you're realizing, well, wait a minute. My fellow gun control advocate, articulates things in a slightly different way. They might reveal some doctrinal slippage between us, but hey, there are all kinds of different ways to formulate a position that is addressed to ultimately satisfying what the people on the other side say is our weakness. That's the thin bit of a wedge into expanding your sense of the variety of expressions of the common doctrine that you share with your allies. That's the key, I argue, to mitigating the most harmful effect of belief polarization, which is the conformity pressure among allies, not the hostility to the other side. You still get to be hostile.
Still get to be hostile. So that is a strange image, almost as strange as a Cowboys fan eating a veggie sausage, but a pretty strange image. And one concern that I think that would be looming over this, and it would be, again, the downstream consequences of participating in this. Because if we did know that there was a strong inclination of your in-group towards maintaining a kind of uniformity of view, developing these more sort of sophisticated strategic accounts, and even correcting, or at the very least calling out, these unsophisticated but more extreme versions, there are social costs for that. Is that something that you would see as a difficulty for this view, or as something where you just say, well, we're talking about what happens in folks' minds, not in terms of whether or not they deliberate to go into these deliberative contexts?
So yeah, I think that you and I will agree on this much. There is no remedy for this stuff.
Yeah, this is baked in.
There is management.
Right, that's right. There's not a solution.
That's right.
We've got sort of strategies for being able to manage this. Right?
And I just want to say, good, right. Yeah. I just want to say that, look, if one of the central dysfunctions that results from belief polarization, in fact, has very little to do with incivility towards the other side, but has more to do with the constraining of the requirements for authentic
in-group orthodoxy. Yeah.
Then this is just a way to limber the mind up. And by the way, this is why this is a separate proposal from the social distance thing. That's another way to sort of recognize that there are all kinds of thoughts worth thinking that you can be friendly towards, even if you think they're wrong. That's the practical challenge, is to build, here's the Wittgensteinian image, I'm sorry, is to place reminders for yourself that there is a range of positions that you are committed to saying are wrong, false, and maybe even bad, maybe even within certain constraints, incompatible with justice, that nonetheless are fully compatible with democratic citizenship. And some of those views are views that are available to the people who are on your political side. If you can internalize that attitude, that some of the people who are my allies think things that nonetheless are wrong, that's the key to depolarization.
Philosophy 15, thinking big thoughts together.
Thanks.